G'day everyone, welcome back to Talking Leadership. Thank you for joining me again on what is a magnificent Saturday morning here in Brisbane, and I'm sure on the Sunshine Coast where our guest today is living and working at the moment. So before I get started, I'd like to thank my co-host in crime here, Mr. Ben Deverson. For those that didn't catch us on the first podcast, Ben is the founder and director of Lawganised. Over to our podcast guest. Today's guest wears multiple hats. He is a lecturer, academic researcher at the University of the Sunshine Coast. But the main reason for asking Adrian McCallum along, how are you, Adrian?
Very well, Eric. Nice to speak with you again. Thanks for having me.
Cheers, mate. So the primary reason for having Adrian along is that he has experience in the military context, and I've had him on the podcast before talking about his leadership experiences, but from a more generic framework. So this time we're going to take a slightly different perspective as we did with the first one of these. So gentlemen, welcome to you both today. I'll hand over to Ben to kick off the questions, mate, and looking forward to this chat. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Eric. And hey, how you going, Adrian?
Yeah, good, Ben. Look, when I knew that you were on this podcast and you might ask me some curly questions, my pulse started rising, of course. I thought, oh no, there's an insider who will be able to incise and cut through everything I say. So I'm on edge, mate, but looking forward to having a discussion.
No, and I hope you're not, but I've also been very keen to chat with you. As I said before we started recording, I've been very intrigued by your background, having served in all three branches of the Defence Force. So I won't steal any of your thunder. What I'm going to do is kick off and let you start with a bit of a background for us. So Adrian, can you tell our listeners, Eric and I, what was the beginning of your leadership pathway?
Sure, Ben. Look, thank you. Look, formally, of course, that was probably when I left school and joined the Australian Defence Force Academy in 1989. As a fresh-faced 17-year-old. I was thinking on this question this morning, and look, before that I'd had, some inverted commas leadership roles as school captain and school prefect and things like that. But as I was riding my push bike this morning, I was thinking on these questions, and I was going, I wonder how much I really thought about leadership when I was in those formative roles. And the answer that I came to was probably not so much. You were just funneled into a role and the principal or someone told you what was expected and you got on well with your mates, and perhaps you were leading in some sense, but certainly my formal introduction to leadership would have been when I joined ADFA in 1989. And then all of a sudden I came from, a fresh-faced 17-year-old Brisbane boy to standing at attention, listening to every man his dog chew my ear off because of, for any number of reasons. So it was a slap in the face to some extent, and welcome to the real world of leadership and beyond.
Okay. So as a 17-year-old at ADFA, what do you think was the biggest shift for you from, let's say, leaving Civvy Street all of a sudden being in uniform and being, as you said, someone chewing your ear off?
Look, I think it was just the rigidity of, time, of action, of behaviour. As you know, and many of our listeners might know, the beauty of those environments is that hopefully you're doing it with a group or a team, and it's those relationships that very quickly bond and support you through those challenging initial times. But it was a real culture shock. And I'm sure I remember sitting on the payphone back in the day, talking to my mum and my dad back in Queensland going, what am I doing down here? And I'm sure many ab initio entrants to these sort of environments may have similar thoughts passing through their head. But look, in retrospect, in hindsight, I love my time at ADFA. I miss it. I still have wonderful friendships that were formed there. But certainly at the time, it was very challenging coming to grips with time management, personal self-management, and just trying to get everything done in limited periods of time.
Adrian, thanks for that. And just to follow up on what my colleague Ben has asked, and this is a more formal question, but you can answer it in any number of ways, given that you've had served in multiple segments of the Australian military. Is what's your view on leadership in that setting versus a civilian setting? Again, you don't have to give us the name of the organisation, but I guess the interest here for someone like me is that I've only ever lived in one world, and that's a civilian world of leadership from what I've been hearing and having conversations with Ben offline and what we heard with our first podcast guest, David Neal, I'm very interested to see what you think are the differences in those settings, if at all, if there is a difference.
Yeah, look, again, thanks, Eric. I was reflecting on this morning. I think, of course, there's clarity with regards to rank, with regards to organisational/management leadership structure. So that's very much in your face, of course, with the military. In the civilian world, we don't wear rank on our shoulders. You don't necessarily know who's who in the zoo. So I think that certainly engenders different forms of behaviour. In the military, whether you respect someone or not, if they've got more rank on the shoulder than you, then you're obliged typically to do what they say. That's not the case, in many civilian work environments where you will probably pause and think, who is this person who's directing me to do X and Y, and why should I follow what they're suggesting I do? So culture, of course, how we define that, we could talk for a long time about what defines workplace culture. Expectations in the military, as I mentioned, we expect to be told what to do by those above us, and most of the time we get on with that and do the job. That's how militaries work, but that's certainly not the case in the civilian world. And I find it interesting, actually, now that I'm back in defence as a reservist, so I'm certainly far more mature in age than I was when I joined the military 33 years ago. I find myself, it's more difficult for me to write my emails to dear sir or ma'am who happens to be a rank higher than me, when I know that I'm probably 20 years senior to them with far greater life experiences. So it doesn't bristle with me too much, but I find myself reflecting upon the behaviour that is demanded of within militaries versus what you might do in the real world. So certainly, the paying of respect to those, more senior to you or in a leadership role is appropriate in both environments, but it's a matter of how you do that. There's certainly differences between those two environs.
Can I tease out just one thing you said there about the culture and this respect for experience in the rank? So let me take you back to when you came out as a very junior, junior and less experienced officer, that once you were in your respective area of work or field of expertise, once you're out and about, that you would have probably had a lot of people under your direct command that were that had put 20 years into service. And so when you're talking about respect, is that an issue about respect for rank being very different to respect for the person wearing that rank? And does that play out in a military context? Because I guess in the world of work, and you've made a point that I haven't really considered in this context, is that in the world of work, if I was to meet someone like yourself or Ben out there, and we start having a conversation, the first thing I'm going to be thinking about is that you guys bring a level of experience to your work that is there because of your age and time spent in different roles. Whereas if you meet someone who looks like they're fresh out of high school and or university, that level of life experience isn't there. You would think, or you would presume. So again, going back to this question, is it about the rank or the person, or a combination of the two from your military time?
Yeah, look, that's a very good question. And I think any junior officer who's placed in charge of a group of soldiers who probably, as you say, have far more experience, maturity, age than them, I think ideally, as the purported or supposed leader, your job is to try and bring those differences as close together as you can, so that they're not only respecting the rank, but they are respecting the person. So they're obliged to respect the rank, but you need to earn their respect as a person. So ideally, over a period of time, through your actions and your care for your soldiers, those two will coalesce so that they respect you and the rank you wear because you treat them as you should. So I think there's probably a discrepancy initially, and then it's a very fast learning curve for anyone in command, and hopefully they can bring those two together so that their troops, yes, are respecting them because they might have a senior rank to them, but they're also ignoring that. They're respecting them because you're a good person, you're leading them well, you're showing care and empathy for them, and you're looking after them as you should and as any leader should.
How did you go in your first command in that respect? Was it easy to bridge that gap, or did you have a few hiccups along the way?
Oh, look, I think there's always hiccups. In fact, everyone I speak to who's had early command experiences, I think that's how we learn, isn't it? Through hiccups. Hopefully the hiccups are small hiccups that we can observe, learn from, and then try again, try better in the future. I think my general attitude in life is I'm probably a non-confrontationalist, so I try not to I try not to engender confrontation. So I'm probably leading towards the too pally at times, and that can get you in trouble. You know, when you're mates with too many people, yet all of a sudden you're in a position where you need to discipline them or whatever it might be. You can bring yourself into conflict of personal and professional relationships. So I think that's something that you hopefully learn fairly early on as well.
Yeah, thanks, mate.
Really good points. And I certainly remember my early days as a lieutenant in the Army, Adrian, and having that well, to use some of the examples you mentioned, being I was 19, just turning 20 in my first year as a lieutenant, having very senior non-commissioned officers working with me, and having that view. And one of the things that I said in my podcast, if you recall, Eric, is having that ability to be vulnerable and say to your platoon sergeant or your other senior NCOs, I do not know how to do this. So I thought that was an approach that I thought worked well, because I saw a lot of lieutenants come through Duntroon after me, and they would simply walk in and say, I know everything. And they would often have a few hiccups, as we mentioned. So I think that vulnerability piece often works. But getting on to some more juicy questions for you, Adrian. So what do you believe are the leadership skills that you've adapted to leadership in your civilian roles in life?
Yeah, look, I wrote a quick aid memoir, Ben, on this, and it comes down to, you know, what is to lead. And I wrote a quick flow chart, and to my mind, to lead is to influence, hopefully to positively influence. And how do you influence people? Well, hopefully you empower them by giving them the support and the responsibility and the respect, the belief for them to get on with any job, whatever it might be. And to empower people, I think you need to understand people. You need to have a relationship with people, and that comes through communication. So by 5 or 6 points, I got down to the point that it really comes down to constantly communicating, keeping people in the loop, understanding of people, what makes them tick, what won't make them tick. You know, how do they respond to certain directives or certain manners, or the way that you might try and persuade things to be done. So it comes down to relationships and relationship building, I think, regardless of the context we're talking about. And in the civilian world, from my experience, you know, of course, no one's wearing rank. The environment that I currently work in, it's full of people going in their own different directions. So it's very difficult at times to corral everyone to one, joint strategic direction. And that takes influence, as I said, and it comes back to how can you engender that influence. And I think that's through supporting, listening to, empowering the personnel that you're working with or trying to lead towards a common objective.
Just to extend that point a little, Adrian, I mean, your background is remarkably unique in not only your military service, but equally that you have actually been in remarkably extreme environments with your Antarctic work and those sort of things. So in terms of those extreme environments, how do you think your leadership is tested there?
Look, that's a very good point. And I think leadership can be tested in those environments, particularly when you don't care sufficiently for self and you have alarm bells ringing about your own physical vulnerability, due lack of sleep, lack of nutrition, whatever it might be. And I think when you're on the edge of survival, to be frank, your ability to keep a cohesive group together and to lead starts breaking down. But I think that's where it comes back to what you mentioned. You need to be open about your vulnerability. And in the small groups that I've worked with successfully in, very extreme environments on the Arctic Ocean, etc., it's having those frank discussions at the start about looking after your mates, essentially, which of course is what the military pushes from day one, so that it's okay to be, deficient in whatever it might be in that time. Let each other know, let your mates know, and they'll back up. They'll stand in for you. They'll back you up because their time might come down the track. So you need to be a tight, cohesive unit, and so that you understand each other's strengths and weaknesses. But you also need to be very happy to, disclose your weaknesses, disclose your vulnerabilities, and the group will wrap around you and support you so that the time will come again when you can lead once you're, top notch again. So again, it comes down to understanding people, I think, and building those solid relationships that can be, elasticized necessarily under stress, but still hold together to keep the team moving together.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Adrian, I just want to extend on this thought that Ben has come up with, extreme environments, and put that question in a slightly different context. And that context is crisis situations. Have you found that your leadership training in the military has equipped you to deal with a crisis in a different way to if you'd not served in that military context? I know this is a bit more abstract, but why I ask this is that at the start of COVID-19, you saw people react one of three ways: head in the sand, react positively, or react negatively. And it was rare to find those individuals. And for those listening, I can see Ben nodding his head because he's probably experienced this through his work. That do you think military training in that leadership context gives you more tools in that toolkit to deal with a crisis situation than not?
Look, of course, I can only reflect on the experiences that I've had. But again, I was thinking on this morning, for better or worse, from the age of 17, when I was perhaps my most receptive to, external stimuli on how to behave and how to lead. All of my stimuli at the time were military, and they taught me in a crisis to take a breath, to take a step back, to put the kettle on, put the brew on, and come up with a plan. So I like to think that in any crises that I'm exposed to, or any teams that I'm leading or involved with, that I can engender that sort of behaviour. So we don't run around like headless chooks, but we go, all right, this is the case. Is everyone still alive? Yes, great. No one's in dire danger. Right, let's put the kettle on and have a bit of a chat. So, those actions, which probably are inherent within me now, I'm sure were formed through my initial military training at ADFA and beyond. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm very curious that in such a structured world that being able to identify when a crisis is coming or once it's hit, what's that formula? And for the life of me, I wouldn't have thought taking a breath and calming down would not be my first reaction. I'll probably react like every other individual that hasn't had this kind of experience and go, what the hell do I do, and how quickly can I extricate myself from the situation as it presents itself? And that I think that takes time and experience too. That I think Eric's reaction now would be very different to my reaction 20, 25 years ago in a leadership position. I think that's a matter of experience, which kind of leads nicely into the next question. From your experience, is your assessment, and it can only be your assessment, obviously, Adrian, so I would take that for what it's worth, that do you believe that military leadership life is qualitatively different to the civilian world of work, or is there some crossover?
Again, I reflected this. The word that I wrote down was somewhat, so I'd say that yes, I think there is some crossover. But if I can briefly go back to what we were just saying, and I'd appreciate Ben's thought on this, I think if we were in a crisis in a military environment, you would hope that the relationships are established between you and your troops and, within whatever that team that you are a part of, so that if you were the one running around, with your head cut off, someone would step up and say, sir or boss or whatever, just step over there. We're going to put the kettle on and talk this through. So I think relationships are established so strongly in the military, especially in tight teams, that hopefully there's sufficient nous, experience, assertiveness within the group that in those situations things can be kept under control. In the civilian world, look, it's funny. I like to think that leaders would step up in terms of a crisis, but in my experience in the civilian world, often people will say, well, you're the boss, you fix it. They don't necessarily feel empowered or supported to be as strong a part of the team to come up with solutions, and they may defer to the supposed ordained leader at the time. So, I think there are some differences there, especially in times of crisis. In general, I suppose it comes back to what we said earlier, that there is no rank, there is no uniform in the civilian world, and you need to lead people differently by bringing them on board, sharing the journey, making sure that everyone's on side, and then empowering people to get on with the job and supporting them through that.
All good points, Adrian, and I would open my comments with, I wholeheartedly agree. Going back to your military context, I remember a little mantra that was given to me once, and I believe it was from a senior NCO who was in that demographic we spoke of earlier, 20 plus years experience to me when I got out of Dunchurn, and he said to me one day, "Sir, never run because the soldiers feel anxious." So it was a bit of a model that I've followed my entire career, and that whilst he was referring to the literally running, what else he was trying to say to me is, don't look flustered, don't look like you're out of control, don't look like you don't know what's going on, and just stay cool. And so I've applied that as best I can, but equally maintaining that rule that I'm happy to be vulnerable and ask for help. But I do also totally agree with your points about the civilian context. And as you were speaking, then I reflected on a point that I really, really disagree with in my world, is when people use the phrase, Adrian or Ben or Eric, you're the guy who makes the big bucks, you make the decision. And I really despise that comment, because I always like to empower people to say, here are my ideas about how we fix this situation. Because I like to empower people to come up with ideas. And I use a military context of course of action development. If you remember the old appreciation process, Adrian, where you'd have to pull together 3 or 4 different ideas to take a step forward in a tactical plan. So I like to say to people, what are your 3 ideas about how we deal with this issue? Because whilst you are the boss, inverted commas, having people that can be empowered to provide you with options is fantastic. If you're the one sitting there considering the options all day, meanwhile, the crisis is probably evolving. So, having that environment where people just sit back and say, well, you make the big bucks, I'll wait for you to tell me what to do. I find that quite challenging. So I do like to change that viewpoint to ensure that people are empowered to give me their ideas.
Yes, I must say in my civilian life, Ben, I do bristle somewhat when a inverted commas leader gives direction without any context or communication or collaboration or deliberation. So it often frustrates me, the so-called leadership styles that I see, and I wish I could slap them around a bit and suggest that there might be better ways of doing this for everyone's benefit. But there are many different folk in the world, and that's how it is.
Absolutely. So let's just continue that point as we look at what leadership capabilities are. But so I've basically said half of my question there, Adrian. So what do you believe are the critical capabilities leaders need?
Look, I suppose I'm going to revert back to the brief flowchart I drew myself earlier this morning, which ends up at the point of, communicate. And that, of course, is to both actively communicate and passively communicate and listen, which comes back to what you mentioned about getting 3 thoughts from others on how they might best progress the situation. So I think it comes down to building relationships. To build relationships, you need time. You need to understand people. Once you understand them, you know how you can empower them. Once you've empowered them, then they believe in you, and you can have some influence on collectively moving people towards a certain objective. And to my mind, via that process, you're essentially enabling or engendering leadership within your team. So the days of you standing out the front saying we're going here and follow me, that may still work if you've gone through those previous steps. But if that's all you do, then unfortunately, I feel you and your situation are doomed to fail. So that's probably my main thoughts on that at the moment, Ben.
One of the best performance reviews I ever read was actually written in Gallipoli, and the review by a senior officer of a young lieutenant read, "This man's soldiers follow him purely out of curiosity." So I often reflect on that to ensure that people don't look at me with pure curiosity in their eyes when I do make a decision. Ideally with the context that they've been involved along the way, but I always refer back to that. Now, all good points, Adrian. Really appreciate those.
Adrian, just to follow on from Ben has just asked, and I might ask this in a slightly different way or tease this out a little bit if I can with you, is that you've given us your list, and I understand that it seems to me, I'm paraphrasing here, that communication is uber important to you, and there's a reason for that. But if I asked Ben's question in a slightly different way, what would your critical leader capabilities be, military context versus civilian context? Would that list change at all? And let me nuance that question. Let me split that into two. Would it change? And do you think in your mind it might have been different earlier in your career till later? Because one thing and I talked about this on my podcast with Ben, and I've talked about this with others, that and it's been brought up in my mind more and more about level of experience as a leader. So a young leader has certain dynamics that they face that more experienced leaders don't. I'm not talking about age necessarily. I mean years in a role as a leader in a certain context. And so do you think this list would have been different in your younger days as a leader versus now?
Command is an option in the military to actually, use or exploit the rank, the position, and say, we need to do this. But, that shouldn't be the means by which you seek to lead. Ideally it should be via the, coercive empowerment model, which should apply in both contexts. But I think as junior military leaders, we proudly walk out of institutions with pips or stripes, whatever, on our shoulder, and we think we're leaders of men. And we start bossing people around. And as Ben mentioned earlier, that's a surefire way to get a quick talking to behind the nearest building by the nearest NCO to say, sir, that's probably not the best way to, attain respect around here. So I think most definitely leadership is a journey. We're constantly, of course, obtaining more and more experiences, and hopefully we're reflecting on those experiences, what worked, what didn't. So our leadership model is evolving over time. And I like to think, and this would be something that would be interesting to examine, whether the discrepancies or the divergencies between military and civilian leadership perhaps move closer together with time, and as leaders gain more experience and maturity in dealing with people generally in a leadership context. I like to think that, as years progress and leaders' experiences progress, that those differences will become less and less over time.
That's the academic coming out, and Adrian, I can sense that quite clearly, and it's one of the not so subtle reasons why I'm doing these podcasts, is to try and tease some of this out, because someone brought it to my attention that had listened to some of my earlier musings on leadership, not online or on the podcast, because it's about the guest, not me, but I always thought, wow, now that I'm in my mid-40s and got a few more grey hairs and I'm wanting to care for at the moment, that suddenly I've got a better take on what leadership is. But I think it's an ongoing development in the person. And if you subscribe to the following, and for me, leadership is about service to others, that you should be maturing in your role as a leader and prepared to learn. And I get a hint from that statement you made before about the NCO having a quiet word with an officer. Did that happen to you, mate, at some point? Did you get a bit of a reality check from someone a bit more senior than yourself?
Look, no, I can't say that I can recall that, but of course I moved between the three services at a relatively junior rank, so I think you're always aware of the different way things work in different services. But one thing that's constant is that generally the SNCOs who have been in the job for many years know far more about it than you. So you better damn well listen rather than talk, and see what you can learn before you start opening your mouth. So I think that lesson's been driven home to me regardless of whether I was wearing blue, white or green. So it's fairly consistent across the ADF, yeah.
Sure. Ben, was that your experience, mate?
Yes. And equally, particularly as you go through your first few years outside of Duntroon, the learning from the army perspective, that is, the learning curve is so steep that understanding those nuances, as Adrian and both you mentioned, yes, you do get some fairly honest feedback behind the weapons training shed or something like that. But I often, particularly as a senior lieutenant, we used to call ourselves subalterns, otherwise known as subbies. And these new subbies would come out of Duntroon with their fresh new pips on their shoulder and nowadays on their chest. And, you'd see a few behaviours that you wanted to quickly rectify. And I would pull a few of them aside and say, hey, mate, because we were the same rank, you need to respect people a little bit differently. You do not know the role that you're performing like they do. And the worst thing you can do is come in and throw a spanner in the works and think that you know how this unit works, how this team works. You need to sit back and absorb and form the relationships first. And, I did have a few young subbies come out of Duntroon when I was a junior captain or a senior lieutenant, and they really did take the wrong approach immediately. You'd pull them aside over a coffee, as Adrian said, and just say, look, sometimes you had to do a pretty swift one, like pull your head in. Otherwise, you do it in a more, let's call it coaching manner. So, yeah, definitely did a few of those in my time.
Sorry, I was just, as Ben was talking there, it got me thinking again academically about, I wonder whether that environment exists in the civilian world. And I don't think it does, at least in my experience. I don't think there's that, in the civilian world, leadership is not necessarily at the fore of what we're doing. We're there to do whatever job it was or is. Whereas in the military, leadership is at the fore. We are there to be leaders. We are trained as leaders. Hopefully we think about it a bit more. Whereas in the civilian world, I'm not sure that we have that environment of nurturing where, younger future leaders are supported in the way or confronted in the way that perhaps they might be in the military. So I wonder whether leadership in the civilian context is a bit slower to be prodded along or catalysed.
Look, I've got an example in my own history. When I left university, I had a couple of years working with my father in his business, and I was looking for work, and I ended up getting a graduate role with the industry department in Canberra. This is when John Howard was in power. So for those listening, you can guess at my age just from that. So John Howard was still the Prime Minister of the country, and I remember that the people involved in the different rotations we had in the department that I was in, they some of them were self-selected to be mentors to the new graduates that were coming in. And I think one of the first discussions I had with my first mentor / buddy was over a coffee, and that basically the best way to enamor yourself and get yourself more stood by your team is to understand that we're all in the same boat. And yes, you're a graduate and you probably may move on to more senior roles, but you in those roles will depend on your team to succeed and vice versa. And if you can take an open mind and not that you think you know everything coming into those kind of jobs, particularly in the public service where there are some very rigid ways of doing things in some parts of some departments. Yeah, I think it's there in bits and pieces, but not in a structured way as the military. And I was grateful for that experience very early on, because I think leaving university, as a graduate going back now 20 years, that they fill you full of ideas that you're going to be instantly leading or being a thought leader in the space that you're going into. And the reality of the world of work is very different once you get in there. People want you to demonstrate that you can prove by your own behaviors and actions that you understand the job and you can do something in that job. That was my experience. I can't speak for others in the civilian context, but is it the same as the military? No, I don't think so. I reckon there are some industry sectors that you just get thrown into the deep end, and if you swim, great. If you don't, there's someone else in the supply of leaders or people for positions that they can replace you with. I don't see it quite the same way. Ben might have a different view because he's worked in different sectors to me, so he may have a different view. Ben?
Yes, I do have a view. I'm not suggesting it's different. However, I believe, as Adrian indicated, I think it's the focus. And as you were both talking, I was reflecting on a few points. What I've found in the commercial environment is that people, I'm not going to say leaders, but I'm going to say people are generally promoted based on a technical or other ability that's effectively not a competency of leadership. And it might be sales performance, it could be the generation of new work or whatever. But the concept of leadership, in my view, has to have, of course, followers. So leadership is a people perspective, equally in terms of the other comments Adrian made around influence and relationships and those sort of things. And the competencies of leadership in the civilian context are invariably not taught. They're learnt through mistakes, which is not a bad thing as well. But I think when you go through the institutions that we have, you very much learn in a very theoretical but equally practical way about what leadership is and how you can form a leadership style and those sort of things. So I have seen many a very, very effective technical individuals, say in the legal or accounting space or whatever context, who's been promoted to a role more senior and all of a sudden leading a team, and that team fails. So and because the competencies required in that leadership role, they simply don't have. And there are certain people who just simply can't take on those positions, and yet they're still promoted into them. So it's an interesting perspective, but I do find in the commercial world that promotion to senior roles where leadership is required is invariably not based upon a leadership skill or quality.
And Eric, if I can briefly put my thoughts here, look, I completely agree with Ben. From my experience, there's whatever the industry is, typically there's KPIs or, funding goals that need to be met. And those who best achieve that, regardless of their abilities to support one another or to lead, may well get trajectorized up the chain. And they may be put into leadership positions, as Ben suggested, based purely on technical competencies. And they may well struggle. And unfortunately, I often see this in my current environment, where you have people in positions of power who may be very good, technicians, very good at addressing the requirements to succeed, but they're not very good at looking after people and, in my opinion, essentially leading. And that's why I mentioned another point. I don't want to digress too much, but I think if you're inherently a leader within an environment that is sans leadership, without leadership, then you need to find alternative pathways to have an influence or to empower people that you're working with, or to enable good decisions to be made and essentially bypass leadership, inverted commas, if necessary, to prosecute, good strategic agenda.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Ben, did you want to ask the last question, my friend?
I would love to, because I have heard some interesting perspectives on this. So in your view, are leaders born or are they made?
Look, Ben, I knew this question was coming, and I did reflect on it as I pushed the pedals this morning, and I'm sure I've spoken with Eric about this before. And look, I can't escape. My opinion is it's predominantly nurture. If we put people in the right environments and we support them and we technically educate them and we essentially empower them with the opportunity, with the responsibility to lead, then I think most people have that innate ability to lead, to establish relationships positively, to influence people and to empower them to a certain directive. So I largely think it's nurture, but of course, there are many people out there through, familial circumstances, whatever it might be, they may not have good leadership models from the day they're born. And perhaps they go down different trajectories where good leadership is not apparent to them. But I'm a firm believer that if we give people sufficient rope and sufficient training and education, then we can encourage them and support them to all be good leaders. Having said that, I won't deny that, nature perhaps does play a part. I'm sure it does. My wife and I were reflecting on one of our children, and from, the day he could crawl, he was commanding his older brother to do X, Y, and Z. So he had limited time to be nurtured, but he was still, to some extent, exhibiting some leadership traits. So I think, yes, there may be an element of nature in there, but I'm a firm believer that with the appropriate environmental controls, the nurturing, then we can encourage and support everyone to be good leaders.
Yeah, no, good points. And if I may point out, Eric, very similar in some respects to our former guest, David Neal, who answered that question with the word both. And without putting words in your mouth, Adrian, I think that's in some respects what you said and what I've been leaning to agree with more as well of late. And I've always said that to lead is not a noun. Leadership is a verb. It requires action. And that action invariably can either be very personal to you, for part of your personality, or equally something that you mirror from someone else. So hence the nature and nurture involved in that delivery of that action.
I wish we had more time. That is a very interesting question that I'd love to delve into a bit further. We could write a paper on that, Eric.
I think after a little while, mate, I'll be able to come back to you with that. I'm still a student of this thing called leadership. I reckon I want to find some people. So I think I'm almost up to 100 episodes, gentlemen. So you're helping me get to that target of 100. And as I'm reflecting back on it, I think the majority of responses say it can be a bit of both. I haven't had anyone really be a few vehemently nurture or vehemently nature. I'm still leaning, I think, towards it can be both. And the fact that we've got a military proves the case, I guess, or helps to prove the case more, that you can take a lump of clay in a young individual, male or female, and with some effort in training and giving them an ability to fail as well as succeed, that you can build leadership capabilities in people. Now, my thought on this, and I think I spoke on this with Ben when I did his podcast, and I'm almost certain we did, it's that degree of effectiveness that delineates very good leaders from okay leaders to not so good leaders. How effective are you in what you do in that leadership role, in whatever context that you're in? So for me, it's maybe degrees of separation rather than it has to be one or the other, because again, like we've discussed in previous podcasts, there are some freaks of nature that you meet that are just naturally gifted orators and can get people to do things they might not necessarily be inclined to do, but there's a way to persuade people with either the written word or the spoken word that can get people to do things as the lead. And so I think it's an incredibly interesting area, and the more hopefully I delve into these podcasts with those with a military background, that it'll clear up my thinking. And it's always an interesting space, because it's like you said, Adrian, before, it's about what birth circumstances do you have to start out with, but then what happens during a life that might change that to provide opportunities to take a step either forward or not, is been my experience. Gentlemen, thank you for your time today. This has been another really good podcast, and it really does extend what we've been talking about around the differences and some of the benefits of being in that military context. And I guess I might ask you both, for those that might be listening to this that are contemplating a military career, what would you say to them? I might start with you, Adrian, first.
I can only, of course, reflect on the pathway that I took, which was a military career from the age of 17, and I can completely endorse it, and I'm living that by being back in the Army Reserve recruiting for the military, because I believe that regardless of how long you serve, the ADF and ultimately your nation, that it will set you in good stead for whatever future career you might have. And if I can have one brief last parting word, Eric, as you were talking, I was thinking, I think to lead effectively, you need to know who you are. You need to believe in self, okay? And I think by empowering people, supporting people so that they are comfortable in them, and only once you're comfortable in them can you comfortably communicate, influence others positively. So I think that's a parting thought that I wanted to share, if that's okay. And I think the military tries to do that. It's about building people up. And yes, the odd NCO is there to keep you in check, but they're scars that you need to have so that you can learn from that and believe more in what you're capable of, and therefore what you can empower your teams to do. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Adrian. Ben?
What he said.
No, you're not going to cop out with that, mate. Would you fly the flag and suggest to a young person, yep, the military is a good career path?
Absolutely. I think that above anything else, whatever service you join, whatever trade that you wish to pursue, the not only personal but technical skills that you are taught in any branch of the military will stand you in good stead for your life, full stop. I've certainly had a career where the military is certainly the minority of my professional career now, but I still to this day employ very specific rules and very specific thoughts and feelings about things that I approach in life today that I learnt in the Army. And I apply a civilian context to that, of course, but they are things that I would call values, rules, mantras, call it what you will, and they guide me today.
Brilliant. On that extremely positive note, can I thank engineer, field scientist, ex-military officer and academic, Dr. Adrian McCallum. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Ben. It's been a great opportunity. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
And to my co-host, Ben Deverson, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Eric. And Adrian, thank you. It's been a fantastic conversation. Really appreciate your time.
For those listening, this has been Talking Leadership. I cannot wait to catch you all on the next podcast. Thanks, guys.